Now we have a full debate with the two speakers on each side. One speaker on each side of the debate. Richard Boyd Barrett and Natasha Hausdorff. Natasha Hausdorff is a UK lawyer, has an extensive career in international human rights law, and has clerked for the Supreme Court, President of the Supreme Court in Israel. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Richard to open the debate.
I'm not joking because I've been sitting up there for an hour. Can you remind me what the title of the debate is?
This House believes the West has failed Palestine.
Okay. Look, first of all, I just want to apologise for the delay. There were three speakers invited to speak on our side, and two of them were deemed, for some reason, by the other side of this debate to be people they didn't want to debate with. And I think that's pretty disgraceful, to be honest with you. And maybe it says something about the attitude of the Israeli state to having a genuine, open and honest conversation with the people who've been the victims of their policies. And I hope it speaks volumes to you about the nature of that regime. And, has the West failed the people of Palestine? I mean, it's hard to put words to just how true that statement is. The people of Palestine have suffered since 1948 years and years of the most brutal ethnic cleansing, occupation, murderous apartheid, being treated as second-class citizens, as a sort of inferior race by the Israeli state since it was established. And if you don't know the history, to be honest, you just have to look at the butchery and massacre and savagery that we're witnessing in front of our eyes. Because
Order in the chamber.
How could anybody do what is being done to the people of Gaza now if they actually respected them as human beings? How could anybody do that? Slaughter in 4 weeks, 11,000 people, more than 5,000 children, bombing hospitals, bombing mosques, bombing schools, bombing facilities that allow them people in Gaza to produce clean water, bombing energy plants. It's a massacre. It's an absolute massacre. And the leaders of Israel made clear their attitude towards the Palestinian people when they commenced this massacre, when Gallant, the Minister for Defence, described Palestinians as human animals. Human animals. Now that dehumanisation of people is the classic prelude to genocide. The classic prelude. It is, and this is the terrible historical irony, it was that sort of dehumanisation of Jewish people by the Nazis that provided the, if you like, the ideological justification for the industrial scale slaughter by the Nazis of the Jewish people in the Nazi Holocaust of the Jewish people. In Ireland, of course, we're also familiar with this, the dehumanisation of Irish people under the penal laws. When we were under British rule, where Irish people were presented as animals, as violent, as deviant, as subhuman, and so on. It was done with black Africans by the big colonial powers, dehumanising them as less developed, less intelligent, and so on. It has always been the prelude to massacres, and we have seen leading spokespeople in the Israeli government doing that dehumanisation, and then going on to say, warning, saying we are going to starve the entire population, 2.2 million people, of water, food, electricity, medical supplies and so on, and then going on to do it. I mean, that is in front of our eyes a public declaration we are going to commit a war crime. And faced with that, those declarations by Israel of what it was going to do to the Palestinian people in Gaza and what it is now doing, and by the way, is also doing on a less intense scale, but doing very, very systematically to people in the West Bank, where there's no Hamas authority, where thousands have been rounded up without trial and taken hostage by Israel. Hundreds have been killed just in the last few weeks in the West Bank, where there's no Hamas. And of course, that comes on top of years and years and years of brutal ethnic cleansing, stealing more and more Palestinian land, more illegal settlements. And it's not just me who's saying this. I mean, we'll be putting a motion through the Dáil next week, again in support of the people of Palestine. But what it's going to detail is what was detailed by Amnesty International and by Human Rights Watch and by the UN Special Rapporteur in the Middle East, by the UN's Council on Human Rights. And to give you some of the sort of spirit of what has been said, Amnesty International has said that Israel, this is before October the 8th, is operating a racist and cruel system of apartheid against the Palestinian people, both within the State of Israel and within the Palestinian territories in Gaza, and so on, deliberately denying Palestinians their basic rights and freedoms, including draconian movement restrictions in the occupied territories, systematic home demolitions, land seizures, annexation of Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. It describes as blockade, it refers to the blockade on Gaza, which has gone on for 16 years, which has left, this is before October the 7th, Gaza in, quote, a perpetual humanitarian crisis, and amounts to the collective punishment of Gaza's civilian population. It talks about the denial of the Palestinian refugees' right to return, which they have under international law. Millions of Palestinians scattered in refugee camps since 1948, living in the most obscene conditions, have the right to return to the place from which they were ethnically cleansed in 1948. Israel denies them that right. And if, by the way, they try peaceful resistance against some of those things, as the people of Gaza did in 2018 with the Great March of Return, an unarmed march of Palestinians in Gaza trying to break out of the prison that Israel imposed on them, shot down in their hundreds, thousands injured. And just on the international community point about this, Human Rights Watch says the international community has contributed to undermining the international legal order and has emboldened Israel to continue perpetrating crimes with impunity. All this before October the 7th. I want to stress these reports were produced a few years ago. It accuses some states of having actively supported Israel's violations by supplying it with arms, equipment and other tools to perpetrate crimes under international law and providing diplomatic cover, including at the UN Security Council, to shield it from accountability. And, quote, by doing so, they have completely failed the Palestinian people and have only exacerbated Palestinians' lived experience as people with lesser rights and inferior status to Jewish Israelis. And you could just go on and on with the indictment. I don't have the time. I strongly encourage anybody who's honest to read the Amnesty report, read the Human Rights Watch report, read these independent organisations who have all said Israel, long before October the 7th, was guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, people have the right to resist war crimes. Black South Africans had the right to resist apartheid. People in Ireland had the right to resist the brutal regime that was imposed on them. Even Leo Varadkar, because I asked him this question the other day, say, what are the Palestinian people supposed to do? Do you accept they have a right to resist? And even he was forced to say, yes, they do have a right to resist. But Israel doesn't believe they have a right to resist. Israel kills them, slaughters them, massacres them if they resist. So what is the answer to this horror? What is the answer to this horror? It is to dismantle the apartheid regime that systematically discriminates against Palestinians on racist grounds. It is to dismantle the settlements. It is to allow the Palestinian refugees expelled in 1948 the right to return. It is to stop the ethnic cleansing, the ongoing ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And, and should this be a radical thing to say, of course it's completely unacceptable to Israel, what about we have equality? What about we have equality from the river to the sea for Jewish people, for Muslim people, for Christian people, for people of no religion, just have equality. In anywhere else in the world, would we accept any less? Of course we wouldn't. But somehow there's an exception made for Israel, that it's okay to have a state that is based on an ethno-nationalist hierarchy, supremacy. It is literally ethno-nationalist supremacy. That's obnoxious to anybody who believes in human equality. It's totally obnoxious. And just like, because the only other comparable regime where that was institutionalised, that racial discrimination was institutionalised in the structures of the state, was apartheid South Africa. The only other place. And what did the world do? Finally, when people like Mandela, and did they use force sometimes, the ANC? They did, I'll finish on this. They resisted because the oppressed have the right, just indeed as Jewish people in the Warsaw Ghetto had the right to resist the Nazis. Absolutely had the right to resist the Nazis. Black South Africans had the right to resist that, and eventually the international community imposed boycott, divestment and sanctions on the apartheid regime and said, we will not cooperate with the regime that is capable of treating other human beings as lesser beings. And that resistance of Black South Africa and of the international community solidarity forced the dismantlement of that regime, and now black and white live as equals in South Africa. Why can't that happen in Palestine? There is no good reason, other than big Western powers back up Israel, give it impunity for decades of crimes against the Palestinian people, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and now genocide, and rush to their side and say, we'll support you. We'll give you more arms. We'll give you more weapons. What's the reason? Biden told us a few years ago. He said Israel was the best investment the United States ever made. I will finish on this. If Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. And he went on to explain we'd have to station tens of thousands US troops all around the Middle East. So it is the United States and the Western powers back this horrific racist apartheid regime because they want to dominate the Middle East. They want to dominate the Middle East and control the resources, the land and so on in the region. And the Palestinians have suffered a very, very terrible price. So if you believe in peace, if you want to oppose war and that sort of cynical politics, stand with the Palestinians against the apartheid regime so that finally we get justice, freedom and self-determination for everybody as equals in the land of Palestine from the river to the sea.
I'd like to thank Richard for his speech and welcome Natasha to close the debate.
Thank you very much. It's very good to be with you in Dublin, having arrived today. But for the slew of misinformation which we have unfortunately just been privy to, beginning, unfortunately, with the reason for the delay in this debate, because it is the case that the only pre-invited speaker who had been confirmed in advance to have been disinvited at the last moment and refused a platform was my partner on the opposition. But I'm nonetheless here to speak on behalf of both of us against the appalling misinformation that we have just heard. I will be addressing the motion in this debate, and I will be talking about how the West has really failed the Palestinians. I'm going to first talk about real oppression against the Palestinian people. I'm going to be talking about brainwashing, and I'm going to be talking third about unrealistic expectations. But before that, it bears marking that Emily Hand's 9th birthday will be celebrated, or not, tomorrow with her in captivity after her vicious abduction by Hamas terrorists. She is an Irish citizen. I'm sure you are all familiar with her name and her story. You are also probably also familiar with the bizarre sequence of events that saw her father celebrating at the news of her death. She was presumed dead in the 7th of October attacks, the atrocities that were committed by Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist organisations who crossed over into the border and infiltrated into Israeli civilian communities. When he was presented with that news, he celebrated because he knew what befalls those who are in captivity, what befalls young girls and women, especially in Hamas captivity. Her 9th birthday tomorrow. How could anyone do this to the Palestinian people, is what we heard already this evening. How could anyone do this to the Palestinian and the Israeli people? Those in captivity under Hamas and those Palestinians who have been in captivity since Hamas's violent takeover of the Gaza Strip in 2006. They won an election in 2005, but since 2006, when in that violent coup they threw their opposition Fatah members off of the roofs of buildings, they have controlled Gaza absolutely, viciously, torturing their own people, not to mention the atrocities that were committed on the 7th of October, and I must have missed reference to that in the speech that we heard previously. What we did hear was a plethora of misrepresentations about apartheid. Well, anyone who has visited Israel will know the utter nonsense that was just put forward to you. When I worked in the Supreme Court in Jerusalem, I worked under an Arab justice. There are currently Arab members of parliament sitting in Israel's Knesset. There are Arab doctors. There are Arab lawyers. There are Arab army officers who are, as we speak, defending the people of Israel against this heinous, barbaric terrorism, which is continuing as we speak, missiles falling onto Israeli civilian communities. They would, but for the Iron Dome defence system. They are in the Gaza Strip, rooting out Hamas terrorism and saving Palestinian civilians from that barbaric treatment, as we speak in Al-Shifa Hospital. We heard about the March of Return, the suggestion that this was an unarmed attempt to break out. The March of Return was a precursor to what we saw on the 7th of October. It involved Palestinian terrorists shooting at Israeli soldiers across the border. It involved them seeking to break through that border fence, which they succeeded on destroying on the 7th of October, and we all know the results of that. Absolutely absurd to be talking about it in the context of unarmed activity or protest. But what we did hear, in respect of these atrocities that were committed, this medieval barbarism, was a justification of it, if you can believe that, a rationalisation of it, an excuse, this idea that it was in resistance to something. I'll come on to what the Palestinian people are right to resist, and that is the brutal, authoritarian dictatorship that is Hamas. Perhaps most troubling from the speaker, we heard calls for the destruction of the State of Israel, the ethnic cleansing of Jews from land. And if that has a place in this illustrious debating chamber, it is a very sad day indeed. So let's talk about the real oppression, ladies and gentlemen. Those Palestinians that are suffering under Hamas, that are routinely tortured, Palestinians that I have spoken on behalf of at the UN Human Rights Council. And let's look at this motion. Why is it that the international community, the West in particular, has failed the people of Palestine? Because of their silence and their complicity. Where are the people speaking out for the way that the Palestinians have been treated in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Gaza, in Egypt, and in the West Bank? Where are people standing up for real Palestinian rights? Because you can take it from me that the Israeli Arab community are the only free Arabs to live in the Middle East. That's why many of them are actually now defending their country, Israel.
Order. Order. Order in the chamber.
They recognise the real oppression that so many of their cousins are subjugated to by the Arab world. And they recognise the opportunities that they have to live with equal rights as Israeli citizens in the only democracy in the Middle East. The second reason that we need to hold the West accountable for the position, for their failure of the Palestinian people, comes down to brainwashing. What we saw on the 7th of October was shocking, but not surprising. 3,000 people do not wake up one morning and decide spontaneously that it is a good day to slaughter Jews. You do not create 3,000 people who are able to cut the stomach of a pregnant woman, extract the fetus before killing them both, to burn children, to rape and slaughter.
Order.
You do not create people who are capable of that.
Order in the chamber.
Overnight. Anyone asking for evidence here?
Order in the chamber.
Anyone asking for evidence here needs only look at the videos that these terrorists have put out onto social media.
Order in the chamber.
Because these are the real war crimes, ladies and gentlemen. And the reason that they are beyond doubt, the reason that they have been so carefully documented, is because the terrorists have revelled in them, have shared the evidence of their barbarity and their atrocities with glee. That, ladies and gentlemen, can only be the result of 30 years of brainwashing in the UNRWA school system. Ever since Oslo and the Palestinian Authority control over the education system, we have seen textbooks and schools and television programmes for children exalting martyrdom, encouraging the exact acts that we saw on the 7th of October, the same ones that were attempted in that so-called March of Return, and the international community has to take responsibility for that, for the funding that it has provided, and for the UNRWA school system in which, according to their own statistics, 3 out of 4 of the terrorists who crossed that border on the 7th of October were educated in. And let's not forget, ladies and gentlemen, this is not just Hamas. The people who crossed that border, including ordinary civilians, and it is thought that ordinary civilians are holding 60 hostages at present. The terrorists included Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Fatah, affiliates of the PLO, the so-called moderates in this equation. Under the pay-for-slay salary system, the Palestinian Authority, the so-called moderates, pays the salaries of terrorists no matter what banner they coalesce under. They pay them according to how many Jews they slaughter, the severity of their crimes and how long their sentence is. That is brainwashing and incentivization to terror. When you promote hate, you reap war. And the final point to address here, the international community's responsibility for the international community's failure of the Palestinian people is unrealistic expectations. And on this, I take the words of the Palestinian Authority President, currently in his 18th year of a 4-year term, Mahmoud Abbas, in respect of Obama's policy on settlements, requiring the ethnic cleansing of Jews in Judea and Samaria. What was Mahmoud Abbas's response? He said, how can I be less Palestinian than the President of the United States? What did he mean by that? He meant that when America took positions advocating for the ethnic cleansing of Jews, advocating for things that no responsible Israeli government would countenance, he, as the President of the Palestinian Authority, was hamstrung. He could not go to a negotiating table asking for anything less. He could far less leave a negotiating table having achieved anything less than the President of the United States was asking for. So it is in that context that promoting Those unrealistic expectations has been pushing peace further away, has been increasing divisions, and that lies at the responsibility of the international community also. On those counts, on the real oppression that the Palestinians are facing, on the brainwashing in UNRWA schools and the incentivisation under the pay-for-slay policy, and on the constant perpetuation of unachievable positions in pursuit, supposedly, of peace, the West has indeed failed the Palestinian Arabs.
I'd like to thank our speakers for their speeches. If there are any questions, please keep it to questions and not statements.
I'd like to ask you, whereabouts exactly will we find the evidence of what Israel is saying Hamas did? Because there's none on the internet. The videos produced by the IDF are very cringy Hollywood style. There's nothing there for anybody.
They were verified.
Order in the chamber. Order in the chamber.
No, you're lying. Can you tell me where to find out? You know, you stood there and spoke when there's evidence.
What it? Okay, that's enough. Yeah. Here, I have a microphone.
Would you behave yourself? Oh, sorry, so if I don't behave myself, you're going to nuke me, are you? I thought it's loud.
Okay, we're going to wrap up this debate. Thank you very much for coming. Would you like to answer?
I'm very happy to answer. So, apart from everything that I have unfortunately seen on social media and the testimonies of survivors, we also have 49 minutes of very strong material which has been shown to the international media. And reputable journalists have confirmed what they have seen. So, if you are not
evidence from the Palestinians,
okay,
not
so
49 minutes.
It's very interesting that people talk about 75 years because there is a misconception that is propagated. It seems to have fallen away in the last month or so. That actually the only objection that the Palestinian leadership has is to Israel after 1967, when Israel recovered territory that had been occupied by Jordan and the West Bank in particular. Right. Yeah, 75 years has been brought up, and that requires an answer. What it actually means, 75 years, is an objection to the state of Israel's very existence in any borders. Yes. That is something, yes, well, some of the members of the audience are agreeing with me. They'll never...
In Israel.
That is something that is incredibly important to understand because it has been consistently the position of the Palestinian Authority and the PLO before it, which of course was established in 1964, before there was any concept of Israel recovering that territory that had been seized from it as a fledgling state after it declared independence, in its war of independence by Jordan. So it's very, very telling. And I encourage anyone here who actually has an open mind to look into these issues and believe the words of the people who are advocating for Israel's destructions. That includes the Hamas leadership, who have said that they intend to commit 7th of October over and over and over again. That is not an act of any resistance. They have an autonomy and complete self-rule in the Gaza Strip. This evening, there was supposed to be a representative of the Palestinian Authority. Who is that person a representative of if there is an occupation? She would be an Israeli diplomat here this evening if there was an occupation. You are being fed misinformation, and I urge you to listen to the words of the Palestinian leadership, that of the PA and in the Gaza Strip, and in particular of their paymasters in Iran.
Let Richard respond.
Does it have a video?
Let Richard respond.
And a child gets done as well in there.
Sir, let Richard respond.
Can you send it the link?
Order in the chamber. Let Richard respond.
Okay, look, I think, to be honest, most people can see with their own eyes what Israel is doing, and the evidence is right there in front of us. And there's no
Order in the chamber.
There's no
Order. Order.
There's no dispute about what Israel is doing in front of the world right now. It's a massacre. It's a massacre. It is ethnic cleansing by any meaningful definition of the word. 1.1 million people have been forced to flee under a reign of terror, and 5,000 children now have been butchered. Now, none of them are responsible for whatever people may claim did or didn't happen, and I don't know what happened exactly on the 7th, but what I do think is all crimes should be investigated. All crimes should be investigated, regardless. But we are witnessing industrial scale crimes which are being self-declared by Israel. To threaten to starve people of water, electricity and food is a war crime. To impose a siege on Gaza for 16 years, that's a war crime. And it's not just us saying it, or the Palestinians, or Hamas, or anybody else. Anybody who's looked seriously at it has said that's what's happening. So to suggest that history started on October the 7th is ridiculous. Is ridiculous. Is ridiculous.
Order.
Is ridiculous.
Condemn Hamas.
No, in my view,
Order in the chamber. Order in the chamber.
I will not condemn people resisting. Order in the chamber. You can say what you like. I don't endorse the tactics of any particular group of people. Just hold on.
Order.
Okay?
Order. Sir, order.
If I might just finish.
Let Richard finish his point.
Okay, 200 people got killed in the last month.
Yeah.
Sir.
Yeah, look, I mean, to be honest, if people are just going to heck, but that's the reality of what the Palestinians have suffered for 75 years. Denied their rights. And I just want to finish.
Yeah, Richard.
I just want to finish because we're not going to get much further. But I just want to finish with the words of some of the founding fathers of Israel about what they were planning to do in the setting up of this state. David Ben-Gurion, one of the founding fathers of Israel, said in a letter to his son in 1937, quote, "We must expel the Arabs and take their places." And Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel, like this back in 1948, and it gives you some indication of the attitude, said the following: "There is a fundamental difference in quality between Jew and native." Okay? And went on to explain in a letter to the British High Commission that we shall expand the whole country in the course of time. This is only a
Order. Okay.
Look, I think you can judge it for yourselves. I think you can judge it for yourselves.
Order in the chamber.
there.
It's just a security issue.
Sorry, Richard. Sorry, Richard, can we go, please?
Yep, no problem.
Everyone help the security.
These three